If anyone knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will really be serving their country. That isn't a line from a gothic horror novel. It's not the macabre fantasy of some madman. It was a statement made in a classified meeting, a call to action from one of the most respected scientists of the 20th century. The man who said it was Dr. Willard Libby, a celebrated chemist who had worked on the Manhattan Project and would later win the 1960 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for developing carbon-14 dating. He was a pillar of the scientific establishment. So why on earth was he demanding body snatching? The answer is buried in a government conspiracy so vast and so chilling, it sounds like something out of a Cold War thriller. It involves a secret project with a deceptively cheerful name, a global network of unknowing suppliers, and the pilfered remains of the recently deceased. This is the story of Project Sunshine, the Nobel laureate who championed it, and the horrifying lengths the United States government went to in order to measure the hidden cost of nuclear war. To understand how a scientist of Libby's stature could end up advocating for grave robbing, you have to understand the man and the terrifying era he lived in. Dr. Willard Libby was, by all accounts, a brilliant and dedicated scientist. He was a product of the atomic age because he was one of the minds who helped build it. As a chemist, he played a crucial role in the Manhattan Project, that frantic race to build the world's first atomic bomb. He stood at the very center of America's scientific and military power. After the war, Libby wasn't haunted by the destructive power he helped unleash. He was a pragmatist, a problem solver. But the world was now living under a new and permanent shadow. The mushroom cloud wasn't just an image of victory, it was a constant, looming threat. The Soviet Union tested its own bomb in 1949, and the Cold War arms race was escalating at a terrifying pace. School children practiced duck and cover drills, their classroom exercises a grim pantomime for nuclear annihilation. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards, stocking them with canned goods and water, preparing for a world scoured by an invisible fire. This invisible fire was the new existential fear: nuclear fallout. A silent, odorless, and deadly dust that could be carried on the winds for thousands of miles, settling on fields, poisoning water, and contaminating the very air people breathed. Scientists knew this radioactive dust was dangerous, but they faced a terrifying uncertainty. How dangerous exactly? What was the threshold for human tolerance? How much fallout could a population absorb before it began causing widespread cancer and genetic damage? This wasn't an academic question. For the US government, it was a matter of strategic importance. To plan for nuclear war and to continue testing ever more powerful weapons, they needed to know the biological cost. They needed to establish what they chillingly referred to as the permissible limits of radioactive exposure for an entire population. But this presented a profound ethical dilemma. How could you possibly measure the long-term effects of radiation on human beings? You couldn't ethically expose living people to fallout just to see what would happen. That would be monstrous. So they needed a different way. They needed a way to read the damage after the fact. They needed access to human bodies. And the man who would champion the solution was Dr. Willard Libby, a scientist whose quest for data would lead him and the country he served down a very dark path. The story of Project Sunshine began with a much grimmer name, Project Gabriel. Started in 1949, Gabriel's purpose was to assess the radiological dangers of nuclear fallout from a potential nuclear war. The project's findings were alarming, confirming that one particular radioactive isotope posed the most serious long-term threat to humanity: strontium-90. This is where the science gets both fascinating and horrifying. Strontium-90 is a radioisotope, an unstable element that emits radiation as it decays, with a half-life of nearly 30 years. But its most insidious property is its chemical disguise. To the human body, strontium-90 looks almost identical to calcium, the essential mineral our bodies use to build our skeletons. When strontium-90 enters the food chain, settling on grass eaten by cows, which produce milk drunk by people, our bodies don't recognize it as a poison. Instead, they treat it just like calcium. It's a radioactive imposter, a chemical Trojan horse. The body readily absorbs it and deposits it directly into bone tissue. There, it can lodge for years, sometimes for a lifetime, silently irradiating the surrounding cells and bone marrow. This long-term internal radiation exposure dramatically increases the risk of bone cancer and leukemia. The scientists of Project Gabriel understood this, and they understood something even more disturbing. This process was most aggressive in the young. Children, whose bones are rapidly growing and absorbing huge amounts of calcium, were soaking up strontium-90 at a much higher rate than adults. Their small bodies were acting like sponges for this invisible poison. This realization led the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, to launch a new, more ambitious, and far more secretive program in 1953. They gave it a disturbingly optimistic name, Project Sunshine. The project's primary goal was to measure the precise amount of strontium-90 in human bones across the globe. By doing so, they could create a map of global fallout and calculate just how much radioactive material was making its way into the human population. And to do this, they needed one thing above all else: human bone samples. Specifically, they needed the bones of the very young. Stillborn babies and infants were the gold standard. An infant's bones offered a perfect snapshot of recent fallout. Their bodies hadn't had time to accumulate years of other environmental toxins. Their bones would show, with chilling clarity, exactly how much strontium-90 a mother had absorbed from the environment and passed on to her child. They were, in the cold language of the researchers, pristine data points. In 1954, Dr. Willard Libby was appointed as a commissioner of the AEC. From this powerful position, he became the program's most fervent champion. He needed data to answer the urgent questions of the Cold War, and he believed the stakes were high enough to justify extreme measures. The line between scientific inquiry and moral compromise began to dissolve. The mission was clear: get the bones, by any means necessary. In a secret AEC meeting on January 18, 1955, the polite fictions of scientific research were stripped away. Dr. Libby, frustrated with the lack of samples, laid the mission bare. "Human samples are of prime importance," he told his fellow scientists, "and if anybody knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will really be serving their country." This wasn't just a shocking turn of phrase, it was a directive. Libby wasn't speaking metaphorically. He went on to reveal that back in 1953, the AEC had already hired an expensive law firm to research the legality of body snatching. The results, he admitted, were not very encouraging. Doing it legally was going to be difficult, if not impossible. So, they decided to do it through a vast and carefully constructed network of deception. This wasn't a program of ghouls with shovels raiding cemeteries. The reality was far more bureaucratic and, somehow, even more sinister. Project Sunshine operated as a sophisticated global collection agency, leveraging a network of doctors, hospitals, morgues, and scientific contacts in other countries. These contacts would procure tissue and bone samples, and sometimes entire limbs or bodies of infants, and ship them back to the United States for analysis. At the center of this network was Dr. J. Lawrence Culp of Columbia University, who coordinated the shipments. Transcripts from that same 1955 meeting reveal Culp casually discussing the logistics, mentioning that they had channels in various cities where his contacts could obtain samples from nearly every death in the age groups they were interested in. The network was worldwide. Evidence shows that samples were taken from countries across the globe, including Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, and nations across South America. In many cases, these foreign contacts had no idea what the samples were truly for. The AEC and its operatives used a cover story. They told hospitals and doctors that the bones were needed for nutritional studies or for research into natural radium. It was a story that was, as one internal memo chillingly put it, merely incomplete, not false. The deepest and most unforgivable deception, however, was reserved for the parents. Grieving mothers and fathers who had just lost a child were never told the truth. They were never asked for consent. In their moment of profound tragedy, their loss was quietly repurposed by the state. Their baby became a data point in a secret war calculation. Over nearly 2 decades, the project gathered tissue samples from at least 1,500 individuals. They targeted stillborns and infants, but also took samples from older children and adults. In one instance revealed years later, a British mother named Jean Pritchard discovered that doctors had removed the legs from her stillborn baby to ship to the United States for testing. To hide this, she was forbidden from dressing her own child for the funeral. This was the machinery of Project Sunshine. It wasn't driven by malice, but by a cold, relentless logic. It was a global system that turned personal grief into classified data, built on a foundation of lies told to the vulnerable. The scientists believed they were serving their country, but in doing so, they violated the most basic tenets of human dignity. For nearly 20 years, from 1953 until the early 1970s, Project Sunshine operated in the shadows. Its findings were classified, its methods buried in secret reports. The data it produced on strontium-90 levels was meticulously analyzed and used to inform U.S. government policy, but the public knew nothing of the project's grim methodology. But secrets this dark rarely stay buried forever. The slow unraveling began in 1994, when President Bill Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, or UNRAVELING. Their mission was to dive into the classified archives and expose the full history of these Cold War programs. What they found was shocking. The committee reviewed hundreds of thousands of previously secret documents. Among them were the files for Project Sunshine. The internal memos, the meeting transcripts, the shipping logs. For the first time, the full scope of the collection network was laid bare. They found Willard Libby's infamous quote. They found the memo about hiring a law firm to study grave robbing laws. They found the records detailing the cover stories used to deceive hospitals and parents. When the UNRAVELING final report was released in 1995, it was a bombshell. It officially confirmed that the U.S. government had sponsored a clandestine program that harvested human remains, specifically from infants and children, from locations all over the world, and had done so through systemic deception. What sounded like a conspiracy theory turned out to be horrifyingly true. The public reaction was one of shock and outrage. For many, it was a profound betrayal. The idea that the government, in the name of national security, would secretly take parts of deceased children without their parents' knowledge was a moral line many couldn't believe had been crossed. Stories began to emerge of families who now suspected their own lost loved ones had been part of the program. A new layer of pain added to decades-old grief. In the wake of the UNRAVELING report, the U.S. government issued a formal apology in 1995 for the thousands of secret radiation experiments conducted on its own citizens. It was a blanket acknowledgement of decades of unethical behavior, from feeding radioactive oatmeal to disabled children to injecting unwitting hospital patients with plutonium. Project Sunshine was just one chapter in a much larger, darker story. The apology was a necessary step, but for the families whose trust had been shattered, it was an acknowledgement that came 40 years too late. The legacy of Project Sunshine is a deeply uncomfortable paradox. On one hand, it stands as one of the most chilling examples of ethical failure in the history of American science. The project was built on deceit, preying on the grief of unsuspecting families and treating the bodies of dead children as raw material for a government calculation. It represents a moment when the fear of a potential apocalypse was used to justify actions that were, in themselves, a kind of moral horror. And yet, on the other hand, the data that Project Sunshine produced had a profound impact. The stark, undeniable numbers showing rising levels of strontium-90 in the bones of children provided crucial scientific evidence that atmospheric nuclear testing was poisoning the planet. This wasn't theoretical anymore. Parallel, public-facing studies like the Baby Tooth Survey in St. Louis, where scientists collected hundreds of thousands of baby teeth mailed in by families, confirmed the same terrifying trend. They found that children born in the early 1960s had 50 times more strontium-90 in their teeth than children born before large-scale atomic testing began. This mountain of scientific evidence, with the secret data from Project Sunshine telling the same story as public studies, created immense political pressure. It gave world leaders the scientific backing they needed to act. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy, who had been shown the findings from studies like the Baby Tooth Survey, signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty with the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, banning all atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. While underground testing continued, this treaty dramatically reduced the amount of radioactive fallout being pumped into the atmosphere. In a dark and deeply ironic way, the data secretly gathered from the dead may have ultimately helped curb the very threat it was designed to measure, potentially preventing countless future cases of cancer and saving untold lives. So the story ends with a paradox. A Nobel Prize-winning scientist who demanded body snatching. A secret government project that violated our deepest sanctities. And a scientific truth so powerful it helped make the world a safer place. Project Sunshine forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. What lines are we willing to cross in the name of the greater good or national security? And who gets to decide when that price becomes too high? The shadow of Project Sunshine serves as a permanent reminder that even the pursuit of knowledge, when untethered from human empathy, can lead us straight into darkness.